Nature is noisy, not only to the ears, but to the eyes. Walk through a forest, you'll see a million different kinds of trees and plants, and each one of them is a little different from all the rest. But beneath this amazing complexity, mathematicians are beginning to observe some simple conceptual structures. At first glance, this looks pretty complicated. But when you look again, you learn that its complexity derives from the repetition of a simple motif. It branches in several directions, branches again in several directions with pretty much the same angles, and again and again. Each small section is just a repetition of the previous one, but on a smaller scale. The mathematical term for this concept is self-similarity, and it's a structure that many things in nature display, from blades of grass to clouds in the sky. When computer graphics people talk about simulating reality, you hear the word fractals a lot. What's a fractal?
Well, I like to take an informal approach to fractals. Fractal for me is more of an adjective than a noun. A fractal object is one that exhibits self-similarity. Prime example is something like a fern. If you look at a small piece of a fern, its geometry looks very similar to the entire fern. That's a very straightforward example, exact similarity. When you go to other natural objects like trees, you start to see some deviations from that pattern. Leaves will be forming, but the idea of a branching where the geometry is similar at the tip as on the entire tree, that's the notion of fractal for me. As I said, it's more of an adjective. But as an overall quality, one notices this property in trees and in other forms of nature, such as clouds, waves, mountains. As you look closer and closer at an object, you see more and more detail. In a way, fractals is an approach to looking at natural objects like trees. In the past, mathematicians have considered surfaces and objects as very smooth shapes. They've ignored the fine detail. They've ignored roughness everywhere. This is a system designed for editing fractal trees. The system stores a representation of the tree, and you notice on this particular tree is very geometric, straightforward. It doesn't look like a real tree, but it suggests the branching structure of a tree. There's a main stem, and from the main stem, two branches come out. And at each branch point, two new branches are coming out. The angle is the same everywhere, the number of branches are the same, strictly self-similar. This set of sliders allows us to vary the parameters of the branching. For example, we can change the branching angle, and by lowering the branching angle, all the branches change at once.
That's looking much more leaf-like, but it's still very regular.
Right. What we can do is we can change some more parameters, in particular the angle, the ratio between the stem and the side branches, to get a new set of shapes. And in this way, we can actually simulate a growth process. Here is a stem, a blade of grass, and as it matures, the branches come out and grow. Still very regular. Every branch is exactly like every other branch.
And that looks more natural, but it's still awfully precise because everything's the same length.
Right. Well, we've given the computer 30 or so numbers upon which to base the geometry, but it can randomly vary those numbers. By rolling the dice, the computer chooses new numbers at every branch point, so that now we're changing the length of the branches. So some of the branches are longer than others, randomly chosen by the computer. This creates a more organic feel to the picture. It simulates randomness in nature. In fact, it's starting to look a little bit like the shapes we saw in the garden earlier. The numbers are analogous to the gene in the plant. A plant has only a small amount of DNA, a small amount of genetic information, by which it has to describe its entire structure. It has to be very economical, and as a result, it repeats the same structure at all scales. This is one of the reasons why nature is so self-similar. In the computer, we want to do the same thing. We only have a few numbers. We can't set every branch. We just need to set the basic, simple description. The computer takes over for us and creates the complexity based on a simple structure. There's a sort of a data economy here, which mimics the logic of genetic economy in nature. In addition to modifying the branching structure, we can control the actual geometry of the stem itself. A lot of plants, ferns, will, when they grow, actually be curled up and open up this way. And once we curl up the stem into a little watch spring, we can actually pull the watch spring perpendicular to the plane of the spring.
Just like grabbing it and stretching it out like that.
It certainly will break your watch, but for many plants, it allows a vine, for example, to grow around another plant. By adding randomness, you can get more gnarly-looking trees like a cherry tree. With one set of numbers, we can get a great variety of trees with the same set of numbers.
Well, you've got the same basic structure for every single tree, but you just sort of roll the dice again, get a different set of numbers in it. But within limits?
We set how much randomness we want. Randomness is a parameter in itself. And in a way, we can perform an aesthetic selection. In nature, there's randomness, and natural selection chooses what species survive. On the system, we can spin the dice and make an aesthetic selection. This one looks right, so we will breed that tree.
Keep
Those
that
parameters are good. Save that one. The ones that don't look good, we throw out. In a way, I use this tool as a means of exploring geometry. I think you'll find a new way of doing science as a result of computer graphics. In the past, scientists have done experiments by writing a formula, setting up an experiment, and if the dial points to the right number, that proves the theory. Now people have pictures to prove their theory. If you set your parameters and the picture you come up with looks like the real thing, that shows that you understood the problem a little better. You've captured the essence of its structure.
Well, those trees were grown on DEC mini-computers, but you can grow your own on a micro. Here's a short fractal program using the BBC B. You can alter all the values just as they did on the film. Now, this one, for example, is asking how many levels of branching would you like? Well, I'll say 5 and set it going. This particular pattern will take about half a minute or so, but if you can spare half an hour, you could grow something more complicated. Here are some that we made earlier today. We've speeded up the process so you can see what's happening. You can choose the angle between the branches, a number of branches and so on. You can even choose the ratio of the branch to the side stem. And here's a slightly simpler one. Obviously, the more complex take longer to draw. You can also choose between random elements, as these have, and a symmetrical pattern like this simple one here.
We've adopted that program from one in this book, The Art of Microcomputer Graphics. The code's available with the program notes and details in the Radio Times, and we're hoping to have a Spectrum version. How about that? Next week, we'll look at how students in American universities have to develop computer skills, whatever their subjects, and ask why British universities are falling so badly behind.
But until then, let's bow out with the trees.